A story about two pairs of boots illustrates how rich people get richer in ways poor people can't. Anytime conversations about wealth and poverty come up, people inevitably start talking about boots. The standard phrase that comes up is "pull yourself up by your bootstraps," which is usually shorthand for "work harder and don't ask for or expect help." The fact that the phrase was originally used sarcastically because pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps is literally, physically impossible is rarely acknowledged. The idea that people who build wealth do so because they individually work harder than poor people is baked into the Western consciousness and wrapped up in the ideal of the American dream. A different take on boots and building wealth, however, paints a more accurate picture of what it takes to get out of poverty. Author Terry Pratchett is no longer with us, but his writing lives on and is occasionally shared on his official social media accounts. Recently, his Twitter page shared the Sam Vim's Boots theory of socioeconomic unfairness from Pratchett's 1993 book, Men at Arms. This Boots theory explains that one reason the rich are able to get richer is because they are able to spend less money. If that sounds confusing, watch till the end and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Author Terry Pratchett wrote, "The reason that the rich were so rich was because they managed to spend less money. Take boots, for example. Bongani earned $1,000 a month plus allowances. A really good pair of leather boots cost 500 rands, but an affordable pair of boots, which were sort of okay for a month or two, and then leaked like hell when the cardboard gave out, cost about 100 rands. Those were the kind of boots Bongani always bought, and wore until the soles were so thin that he could tell where he was in Kempton Park on a foggy night by the feel of the cobbles. But the thing was that good boots lasted for years and years. A man who could afford 500 rands had a pair of boots that'd still be keeping his feet dry in 10 years' time, while the poor man who could only afford cheap boots would have spent a 100 rands on boots in the same time and would still have wet feet. In other words, people who have the money to spend a little more upfront often end up spending less in the long run. A 500 rands pair of boots that last 5 years essentially cost you 100 rands a year. But if you can only afford 100 rands up front for a pair of boots that last 6 months, that's what you buy, and you end up paying twice as much over a 5-year period. There are so many areas in which this principle applies when you're poor. Buying in bulk saves you money over the long run, but you have to be able to afford the bulk cost up front. A reliable car that doesn't require regular repairs will cost more than a Toyota Tazz, but if the Toyota Tazz is all you can afford, that's what you're stuck with. You'll likely spend the same or more over time than if you'd bought a newer and higher quality car, but without the capital or the credit rating to begin with, you don't have much choice. People who can afford larger down payments pay lower interest rates, saving them money both immediately and in the long run. People who can afford to buy more can spend more with credit cards, pay off the balances, build up good credit, and qualify for lower interest rate loans. There are lots of good financial decisions and strategies one can utilize if one has the ability to build up some cash. But if you're living paycheck to paycheck, you can't. Climbing the financial ladder requires getting to the bottom rung first. Those who started off anywhere on the ladder can make all kinds of pronouncements about how to climb it. Good, sound advice that really does work if you're already on the ladder. But for people living in poverty, the bottom rung is just out of reach, and the walls you have to climb to get to it are slippery. It's expensive to be poor. When people talk about how hard it is to climb out of poverty, this is a big part of what they mean. Ladder climbing advice is useless if you can't actually get to the ladder. And yet, far too many people decry offering people assistance that might help them reach the ladder so they can start taking advantage of all that great financial advice. Why? Perhaps because they were born somewhere on the ladder, even if it was the bottom rung, and aren't aware that there are people for whom the ladder is out of reach. Or perhaps they're unaware of how expensive it is to be poor and how the costs of poverty keep people stuck in the pit. Hopefully, this theory will help more people understand and sympathize with the reality of being poor. A cost of poverty, also known as a ghetto tax, a cost of being poor, or the poor pay more, is the phenomenon of people with lower incomes, particularly those living in low-income areas, incurring higher expenses, paying more not only in terms of money, but also in time, health, and opportunity costs. Costs of poverty can also refer to the costs to the broader society in which poverty exists. A ghetto tax is not a tax in the literal sense. It is a situation in which people pay higher costs for equivalent goods or services simply because they are poor or live in a poor area. A paper by the Brookings Institution, titled From Poverty, Opportunity, Putting the Market to Work for Lower-Income Families, is widely cited as a study into ghetto taxes, although the report itself does not use the term. The problem of ghetto taxes is closely associated with mobility. One study in the United States showed that higher prices might be prevalent in some neighborhoods, but people with access to a car would have more access to affordable goods and services elsewhere, whilst those without a car would bear the brunt of higher local prices. Lower-income consumers are much more reliant upon alternative financial services that are more expensive, such as loan sharks and payday lenders, pawnshops. For those with a traditional bank, customers who can maintain a minimum bank balance can avoid fees, such as monthly fees, or qualify for higher interest rates on their deposits, while overdrafts can rack up hundreds of rands of debt in just a few days. There are fewer ATMs in poor areas, and often they are third-party machines that charge fees to all users. An area with inadequate access to traditional financial services is known as a banking desert, places like townships and rural areas. Poorer people have worse and more expensive health conditions, and poorer neighborhoods have fewer doctors' offices, medical facilities, and pharmacies, a phenomenon known as a medical desert or pharmacy desert. People with no or low-quality health insurance receive less preventive and routine health care, leading to poorer health. Medically harmful environmental pollution can be higher in minority neighborhoods, such as in fence-aligned communities. Due to this decreased access to care, maternal mortality and infant mortality rates tend to be higher in such areas, as well as premature and underweight births. This has cascading effects on communities in psychological, social, political, and economic costs of varying degrees. These conditions are often correlated with various psychological and medical chronic conditions, disabilities, and/or disorders such as ADHD. As an example, the cost of diagnosis are also significant. The firm Neil Psychological Services charges thousands of rands for 4 evaluative sessions and testing for ADHD. Lack of access to mental health care is prevalent among impoverished communities in no small part because of its prohibitively expensive costs. Poorer neighborhoods tend to have fewer nearby jobs, requiring longer commutes and higher transportation costs in terms of both time and money. This can decrease employment opportunities, increasing unemployment. Public transportation tends to underserve poorer areas, a situation known as a transit desert, which can reduce access to quality schools, healthcare, food, and other products at affordable prices. Poorer neighborhoods often have fewer street and sidewalk improvements, including curb ramps that help not only disabled people using wheelchairs, walkers, and canes, but also people with babies using strollers, and those engaging in exercise such as cycling. These inequalities are known as the transport divide. Highways tend to be routed through poorer neighborhoods, carving up communities and walling them off from more prosperous areas. Small Pakistani shops that provide little to no fresh food tend to cluster in low-income neighborhoods, driving out fuller-service grocery stores and supermarkets that provide more fresh food. The price of fresh food then becomes more expensive due to the added costs of the consumer's transportation to more distant stores in both time and money, or because stores that stock fresh food in low-income communities do so at higher prices due to factors such as fewer economies of scale in purchasing power, sales volume, and managing the supply chain of perishable food. Other stores that may provide food to low-income areas include gas stations and convenience stores, neither of which tend to carry much fresh food. Areas without access to fresh food are known as food deserts. In addition, local laws have strict rules about land use in the form of zoning laws, which may not allow for people to plant gardens for either community or private use, which further hinders access to food. This disproportionately impacts impoverished people because they cannot easily access grocery stores as a replacement source of food due to food deserts, transportation costs, and threat of crime. Poor people are more likely than wealthier people to be fined or jailed for the same crime, or to be wrongfully convicted of a crime. and poor neighborhoods can be targeted for more police enforcement actions than wealthier neighborhoods. Courts can impose fines and fees that result in court debt, incarceration, and driver's license suspension for those who can't pay. Courts can impose cash bail, requiring the accused, while presumed innocent, to make a refundable cash deposit in order to get out of jail before a trial, with the money not refunded if the accused is not on time for all of their court dates. Someone who is unable to pay the full bail amount may purchase a bail bond, under which the accused pays a non-refundable percentage of the bail amount and promises collateral like a car, home, or jewelry to the bond issuer in return for the bond issuer paying the full bail amount to the court. A bond issuer may hire a bounty hunter to capture a creditor who does not appear in court. While in jail, the accused can be charged high fees for communications such as phone calls and emails, and for commissary items. Let's talk about school education, for example. The public school system is underfunded with poor infrastructure and absent teachers in many places, leading families to opt for private schools that charge hefty fees. Those who can't afford top-tier schools are often stuck paying moderate fees for schools that offer substandard education, leading them into additional costs like tuitions and exam coaching to bridge the gap. This vicious cycle of spending more to get less traps the middle class, even after best efforts, to spend more in the long run because they can't afford to make large, upfront investments in quality goods or services. An even worse part follows. The psychological burden of living paycheck to paycheck, of not having enough money to make smart financial decisions in the long term, can be overwhelming. Poverty is not just a lack of money. It's not having the capability to realize one's full potential as a human being. Amartya Sen. I refuse to offer you in this video misleading optimism. It would be sinister on my part. If you are watching this and are not where you want to be financially, just know this financial gap is only going to get wider in time. India's middle class is the new lower class. Get to work, and so will I. In economics, a cycle of poverty or poverty trap is when poverty seems to be inherited, preventing subsequent generations from escaping it. It is caused by self-reinforcing mechanisms that cause poverty, once it exists, to persist unless there is outside intervention. It can persist across generations, and when applied to developing countries, is also known as a development trap. Families trapped in the cycle of poverty have few to no resources. There are many self-reinforcing disadvantages that make it virtually impossible for individuals to break the cycle. This occurs when poor people do not have the resources necessary to escape poverty, such as financial capital, education, or connections. Impoverished individuals do not have access to economic and social resources as a result of their poverty. This lack may increase their poverty. This could mean that the poor remain poor throughout their lives. Controversial educational psychologist Ruby K. Payne, author of A Framework for Understanding Poverty, distinguishes between situational poverty, which can generally be traced to a specific incident within the lifetimes of the person or family members in poverty, and generational poverty, which is a cycle that passes from generation to generation, and goes on to argue that generational poverty has its own distinct culture and belief patterns. Measures of social mobility examine how frequently poor people become wealthier, and how often children are wealthier or achieve higher income than their parents. Some activities can also cost poor people more than wealthier people. For example, if unable to afford the first month's rent and security deposit for a typical apartment lease, people sometimes must live in a hotel or motel at a higher daily rate. If unable to afford an apartment with a refrigerator, kitchen, and stove, people may need to spend more on prepared meals than if they could cook for themselves and store leftovers. In the case of banking, people who cannot maintain a minimum daily balance in a savings account are often charged fees by the bank, whereas people with larger amounts of wealth can earn interest on savings and substantial returns from investments. Unbanked people must use higher-cost alternative financial services, such as check cashing services for payroll and money orders for transferring to other people. People who have had previous credit problems, such as overdrafting an account, may not be eligible to open a checking or savings account. Major reasons for not opening a bank account include not trusting banks, being concerned about not making a payment due to a bank error or delay, not understanding how banks work, and not having enough money to qualify for a free account. Though most industrialized countries have free universal health care, in the United States and many developing countries, people with little savings often postpone expensive medical treatment as long as possible. This can cause a relatively small medical condition to become a serious condition that costs more to treat, and possibly causing lost wages due to missed hourly work. Though poor people may have lower overall personal medical expenses simply because illnesses and medical conditions go untreated, and on average lifespan is shorter. Higher income workers typically have medical insurance which prevents them from experiencing excessive costs and often provides free preventive care, for example. In addition to personal savings they can use, higher income workers are also more likely to be salaried and get sick time that prevents them from losing wages while seeking treatment. Because no skills or experience are required, some people in poverty make money by volunteering for medical studies or donating blood. Another theory for the perpetual cycle of poverty is that poor people have their own culture with a different set of values and beliefs that keep them trapped within that cycle from generation to generation. This theory has been explored by Ruby K. Payne in her book A Framework for Understanding Poverty. In this book, she explains how a social class system in the United States exists, where there is a wealthy upper class, a middle class, and the working poor class. These classes each have their own set of rules and values, which differ from each other. To understand the culture of poverty, Payne describes how these rules affect the poor and tend to keep them trapped in this continual cycle. Time is treated differently by the poor. They generally do not plan ahead but simply live in the moment, which keeps them from saving money that could help their children escape poverty. Payne emphasizes how important it is when working with the poor to understand their unique cultural differences so that one does not get frustrated, but instead tries to work with them on their ideologies and help them to understand how they can help themselves and their children escape the cycle. One aspect of generational poverty is a learned helplessness that is passed from parents to children. A mentality that there is no way for one to get out of poverty, and so in order to make the best of the situation, one must enjoy what one can when one can. This leads to such habits as spending money immediately, often on unnecessary goods such as alcohol and cigarettes, thus teaching their children to do the same and trapping them in poverty. Another important point Payne makes is that leaving poverty is not as simple as acquiring money and moving into a higher class, but also includes giving up certain relationships in exchange for achievement. A student's peers can have an influence on the child's level of achievement. Coming from a low-income household, a child could be teased or expected to fall short academically. This can cause a student to feel discouraged and hold back when it comes to getting involved more with their education because they are scared to be teased if they fail. This helps to explain why the culture of poverty tends to endure from generation to generation, as most of the relationships the poor have are within that class. The working poor are working people whose incomes fall below a given poverty line due to low-income jobs and low familial household income. These are people who spend at least 27 weeks in a year working or looking for employment, but remain under the poverty threshold. There is also controversy surrounding ways that the working poor can be helped. Arguments range from increasing welfare to the poor on one end of the spectrum to encouraging the poor to achieve greater self-sufficiency on the other end, with most arguing varying degrees of both.